So, recent CPP analysis suggests that places in the former Red Wall areas of the UK are amongst the most vulnerable to cost of living pressures. If greater place-based devolution would align and accelerate delivery of economic, environmental and social objectives, could more progress be made? Well, we're going to hear now from two people who've been trying to keep alight the flame of inclusive regional economic growth. See what I did there? Andy Haldane, CEO of the Royal Society of Arts and former government advisor on Levelling Up, and Marvin Rees, Mayor of Bristol since 2016. Charlotte Alldritt will chair this session for us, all about global challenges with local impacts. Please welcome Charlotte, Andy, and Marvin.
Martine, I think my career feels complete now that I've had that live scientific experiment here in the Royal Institution lecture hall. A little bit of crowbarring from CPP as to the analogy you may wish to draw, but I think it's not unfair to say that certainly the UK's economic climate and the UK's economic stability has been potentially hostile to some of the measures that we think lead to long-term inclusive growth. So, as Martine said, some food for thought, but also a way of waking us all up and certainly giving me a smile after lunch. On to slightly more serious matters. Really privileged to be joined by Andy and Marvin to talk about their experience in driving the inclusive growth agenda or levelling up, and we can perhaps get into potentially where those ideas differ. But I really wanted to start today's conversation with a reflection on the last few months, and to ask first to Andy whether you think levelling up is back in town, and if so, how do you expect it to play out under this particular brand of Conservative leadership?
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. And I certainly hope it is back in town and city and village, because it always was meant to speak to all parts of the UK and all urban types. Is it back? I hope so. I'm not sure in a way, Charlotte, it ever fully went away. So, even during that summer, early autumn interregnum, quite a lot was happening beneath the surface on levelling up, particularly as regards devolution deals. We've seen a number of those announced since the white paper was published, and a few more last week were mooted. So the wheels never entirely seized up. There was action on governance and decentralisation. Do I think, though, that with Michael Gove back in the saddle as Levelling Up Secretary of State, that will give it an extra giddy up? Yes, I do. Do I think that's just what the doctor ordered? Yes, I do. Because at root, levelling up is about seeking to unlock opportunity by stimulating the supply side of the UK economy at the spatial level. And ultimately, that is just what this country needs. If it is to grow in a sustainable way, in an inclusive way, we don't need a new grand plan, national economic plan. We have one hiding in plain sight in the form of Levelling Up, which is doing a national economic plan from the bottom up, which is the right way around.
Marvin, does it feel like Levelling Up is continuing, has been continuing, and will be, as Jeremy Hunt kind of mentioned very quickly in passing, this government's national mission? Does it feel like that for you in Bristol?
Well, as with most things, yes and no. First off, I agree, actually. I think this is not for tweeting, but I think you'll find a number of Labour leaders of cities are quite relieved that Michael Gove's back. Because while I may, on the whole, disagree, obviously, with being his political camp in terms of party politics, we think we got someone who thinks and reflects. And we did, some of the people that went before him, we didn't think, thought much, and reflected. And that was a problem, right? So there's someone we think that we could actually have an adult conversation with and make some progress. I'd also say, just about levelling up, that part of the conversation is about talking about national government here. We've always been in the business of levelling up, whatever we call it, right? We cannot grow a city. One of the big challenges facing cities all over the world is how you continue on this journey of rapid urbanization while your cities remain places people can afford to live. You don't breach planetary limits on biodiversity and climate change, which you don't compound inequalities that turn into population sickness and social instability, fragmentation and instability. So levelling up feels, and I'm not trying to pick a hierarchy of it, it feels like a national government talking about stuff that we were trying to do anyway, right? So it never went away at the city level, I'd say, but certainly we felt a national focus on levelling up kind of waning a bit. But what I would also say about it is it has to be real. So let me give you a very immediate example of where this has to get into some nuts and bolts, right? If we're serious about including more sources of power and leadership in a national debate. So I've just come back from COP, right? I was there with Susan Aitken, the leader of Glasgow. In the lead up to COP, right, there was not one conversation between national government and me as chair of Core Cities and Susan as the former host of COP about what the UK should do at COP. Now, to me, that's 101. That's like basic. Let's get ourselves organised, have a coherent UK position. Let me get national government, UK investors, UK cities, UK charities in a room, develop 3 top priorities so when we go to COP and our £2 million pavilion that we bought, we can make the best use of it. That didn't happen. There is no plan to have a post-COP review. Climate change is one of the most important issues on the ticket, and it's going to cost billions, trillions of pounds to deal with it. So you take every opportunity to maximise investment out. That conversation's not happened, and I've not heard a breath of that happening. So to me, that's one of the tests. We've got to have the banner, but it has to be within the practice, and the practice, I've not seen it really hitting the ground.
So lots of things to think about there, but do you think then that levelling up is still seen through the prism of what central government can do, rather than, as much as it wants to talk about devolution deals, actually looking at how its relationship with local government and regional government and kind of pan-regional government, thinking about sort of Northern Powerhouse, Western Gateway, etc. Do you think it is adopting that bottom-up view in the way that Andy described?
Well, I think there'll be a battle for it. I think there's an intention to do it, but again, with all these things, they're challenging. I think it's the right idea, and it's nice to get it articulated and put in a document that actually says this is what we're pointing at. And then I'm sure Andy would be doing the pressure, but we will. There's a friend of mine who's a bit of an activist. He says, occupy the rhetoric, right? And actually, that's one of the things that happened with levelling up. The phrase was used, and then city leaders, local government leaders all around the country tried to get hold of the definition to make sure they weren't defined out of benefiting from it, which was the danger when we thought it would just be a geographical north-south issue rather than an issue that took geography into account, but also people groups who were left behind wherever they live, which is what I think one of the real dangers. So the slightly unfair criticism would be it is national government talking about national government and how much space they're going to allow for these local government machinery and whatever to do something. So it would be about national government talking about itself. The more gracious way of talking about it, I think, would be to say that there is a recognition now that the country, and dare I extend it to the world, cannot be run by national governments working alone or even together. In a world in which so many of the issues are post-national, local government energy resources, dare I say city energy resources, have to be released to shape national and international policy.
And one of the reasons, I mean, you've just come back from COP, which is a process which is arguably failing to get a handle on warming global temperatures, as much as there is will amongst citizens and leaders, national and local. What does that then suggest to you as to how, if we were to build a new system of governance where mayors play an increasingly prominent part, I guess what can we learn from how we've tried to do either that kind of national, local level relationship in the UK, but more pertinently at an international level?
Well, shameless plug, you can find the answer in my TED talk. Put the viewing numbers up. I think there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum of ideas, a vacuum of energy and a vacuum of ability to get stuff done. And I think that a worldwide network of mayors, and there are worldwide networks of mayors developing, there are about 300 city networks in the world at the moment, in many ways forming in a world in which it is increasingly felt and recognised that national governments are failing to deliver on issues at a time. One of the things I shared when I was at COP was around a report in the week before COP that there were no credible plans on the table that brought us to meet the targets we need to meet. And I'm saying they're not targets, they're limits, right? But I bet that was about adding up national plans. What if you added up the plans of the world's cities to decarbonise? I suspect that you come up with a different number, and you might end, I'm not saying you would, but you might end up with a number that actually was meeting those limits. But then the challenge is, how do you get finance into the hands of city leaders? And at the moment, finance is bound up between international finance, public money, and national governments. It struggles to get down to the place level.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah, finance is failing on climate change. Andy, what do you think in terms of the finance of levelling up?
Well, maybe a couple of points on that. I mean, one, it's good to have the conversation about finance generally, including for levelling up, not exclusively through the prism of central government, to your point from earlier on. I mean, in some ways, I think too much of the relationship around levelling up has been about local leaders looking up to central government for financial crumbs from the table. And I do think that dynamic needs to change pretty fundamentally if we are to make a success of levelling up. For two reasons, really. One, when we think about local leadership, and with the greatest respect to Marvin, it's not just about mayors. It ought to be as much about local leaders in universities, local leaders in the private sector. They all have an equally important role to play in driving change in place. I was just with Marvin just last week, actually. I was across in the States for a couple of weeks discussing regen of cities in the US. And the blueprint there could not be more different from the blueprint we often adopt here. It's often private sector initiated. The financing stack for those projects often comes predominantly from philanthropic foundations and from the private sector. And there's far less of a parent-child type relationship than I think we sometimes see here, and I think that needs to change. That's on the general. On the specific around financing, we know that fiscal finances are going to be tight, probably for as far as the eye can see right now. But we're in the fortunate position as a country that when it comes to private financing, the pockets are pretty deep. For patient capital in particular, pension fund capital being a case in point, there's a pot of £3 trillion, only a tiniest slither of which currently finds its way into local projects of various types. Some of the regulatory rule announcements finalised last week ought to unlock more of those riches than has been the case in the past. That's the supply side of the equation. The demand side of the equation is more local leaders like Marvin, but including private sector leaders and university leaders coming forward with investable propositions in that place into which that patient capital could then flow. So there is a financing question. There has been a financing gap historically. I think there are ways we can now begin to close that gap by using a different financing stack than that which we've had in the past.
Yeah, so and we're in that space.
Yeah.
So for example, there's a network, but again, this is where we do need to get things aligned, isn't it? So we've just done a deal in Bristol around private finance, right? We've done a deal with Ameresco and Vattenfall, 2 energy companies, not British, by the way. It is now going to result in £1 billion investment in energy in the city, which promises to transform the city's relationship with energy from generation of renewables to distribution, smart use and storage. So that's fantastic. That's private money, no government money whatsoever. But it cost us £7 million and cost us 3 years to do that deal, all right? And by the way, we took that £7 million from our revenue account, which is the same account that we use to pay for adult social care and children's services. So the dilemma in local government is to get projects bankable, ready for the market, costs loads of money and involves lots of risk. Because during the 3-4 years we were getting LEAP ready, the journalists and the opposition were prowling around saying, hold on, there's a lot of risk here. You should be spending money on SEN, right? And what if it fails? Fantastic. So actually what we end up doing is taking a huge risk and pushing water uphill, when actually what could happen is what the role of public money in that sense is an enabler. It's the catalyst and sometimes the market maker, in that. And that's the challenge faced by local governments all over the place. The other dilemma is in that situation, if, for example, I mean, the local government wants to, well, certainly from us, we want to be a stable partner. The more predictable we can be as a partner, as a local government, the better the environment we can create for business and for our public sector partners to make longer term plans. But the current funding model is between national government and local government doesn't give us the space to be dependable, because here's a funding pot. Basically it runs like this, doesn't it, right? Government makes an announcement, we spend the night trying to work out what that means, and then they say, fight for that. When I was in junior school, there was a game called Scrambles. Any of you heard of this game called Scrambles? Kid's got 1 sweet left, has no strategy of how to distribute the sweets, so just chucks it in the air and says Scrambles, and you fight for it. That's how local national funding sometimes works with local government. So and that was our concern over levelling up, that it would be, we want to tackle inequalities and we want to deliver inclusive economic development. Here's £1 billion to do it, fight for that. Some of you will get it and some of you won't. Well, that does not allow us to be dependable and predictable and create the conditions that are more conducive to winning inward investment. So that's where we got to get that alignment and coherence. Sorry, the only last thing I would say is, if I've got £15 worth of need in a £10 budget, do I spend, and I've got 3 demands on my time: children's mental health, adult social care, and a planning expert. What would I spend my £10 on if they all cost £5? You drop the planning expert, you drop the person that creates the conditions, that knows how to manage the market, because people want their money spent on adult social care and children. And again, so it's one of the hidden costs of austerity, is that we've lost that backroom capacity to do the deals. We've lost that backroom expertise to enter into these markets into which local government has not traditionally been involved in, as in reaching out to private finance. And that comes at a long-term, that comes at both short and long-term cost.
Well, I think I want to come back to austerity and the possibility of austerity 2.0 as it's being built, although potentially a little bit further down the line than we might have feared beginning of last week. But Andy, maybe if I could get your reflections on the Autumn Statement more generally, and then the kind of the threat to levelling up funding, in part for the reasons that Marvin's just described in terms of the hollowing out of local government. You previously talked about how we need to potentially not necessarily allocate a lot more new money, but it's about prioritisation. I think, Marvin and other local leaders would push back on that and say it's been hard to deliver and it looks like it's going to get harder still.
So an autumn statement, maybe 3 observations on that. In terms of its objectives, I mean, there was a simple do no harm objective in financial markets. That can't be taken for granted, as we saw from its predecessor, but was navigated, so that was a sort of mini tick. There was a do no harm to near-term growth prospects, given the squeeze this year and next, and given that there was a net modest fiscal easing over that time horizon, I think that would count as doing no harm to near-term growth. For me, what was really missing, though, most fundamentally, was a coherent story and plan for growth beyond the near term.
I think so.
That was largely absent. And indeed, if anything, there were bigger question marks asked about that, given the uncertainty about what happens beyond 2024 to capital spending and all the rest of it. That, for me, remains a big question mark, and the most important question mark of all, of course, because history tells us that you don't cut your way out of a fiscal deficit, you grow your way out of fiscal deficit, and therefore the absence of a growth plan makes it a big question mark as to whether you're doing the right thing, not just for the economy, but even for the fiscal finances. Now, do I think it's eminently possible to put in place the foundations of such a plan? Absolutely, I do. And levelling up absolutely would be part of that. But for now, that plan remains, in the shadows, I'd say.
And how do you feel about the kind of prospect for local government finance going forward? Do you think that's under threat, or are you saying that we don't know because Hunt's pushed the bulk of cuts in real terms down the line?
Yeah, I mean, both. We don't know, but it's definitely under threat. There's no question that the pinch is going to be felt somewhere outside of health and social care, and possibly some on defence. Quite how where those cuts fall is uncertain as things stand. The truth is, as Marvin would know much better than me, local government finances are starting from a highly suboptimal position in the first place, both in terms of quantum and in terms of allocation, and that would therefore risk making a bad situation somewhat worse. For what it's worth, I completely agree with Marvin on the current allocation mechanisms to local places. Far too many pots, far too complex criteria, far too short term, and I'm personally strongly against competitive bidding, the scramble that you mentioned. All of those are anathema to long-term planning and investment at the local level. So even before you get to the question of quantum, there's a question of allocation devices, which are not as they would be, but it's definitely a risk both to levelling up and also, they say, to growth as well.
So one more question. You had your hand on the pen of the Levelling Up white paper. Why couldn't we all know, those of us who work in and around local government finance, know what's needed? Why could we not see that as one of the leading policy recommendations to really unlock and unleash the power of devolution?
Yeah, so it wasn't just me with a hand on the pen, unfortunately. It wouldn't have been quite the same document if that had been the case. And, as ever in policy, you get through as much as you can. You do as much as you can within the constraints that you face. One of those constraints, even true earlier in the year, was the fiscal constraint. And that constraint has got more binding in the period since the white paper was written. There's no question about that. As I say, I think there are some unanswered questions, both about allocation of existing pot to local government, and to the quantum of that pot. We'll have to have those conversations down the line.
Oh, is there anything you wanted to come back on from that?
Just a few things that spot my, and I totally agree. One of the messages we constantly give in local government is, you don't get everything you want. Sometimes you get what you can, right? That's a democracy, actually. So I'd say one is that competitive funding, by the way, I think is kind of symptomatic of an absence of a strategy. Right? I don't know what to do, so fight for that, you know. And whoever is the most beautiful application in front of me will get the money. But that's not necessarily the most strategically placed. Doesn't take account of the factors, you know, that may actually create the conditions for growth and the sequence within which you might want investments to take place.
And central government, sorry to interrupt, but it's shown itself as an unreliable partner as well, because, you know, you had to jump to bidding for investment zones funding that a few weeks later, you know, that the criteria change again. Yeah,
well, LGA have put some numbers around how much we spend on bids. And it's a lot of money spent on bids, and some particularly, which is particularly galling when they then don't work, because that's, you've taken that money out of your budget. But there's a couple of things I would say just about the last budget. One is, I think there's a real danger that we're burning our coat to keep ourselves warm. You know, we could end up incurring costs of cuts. So we're looking at saving £67 million now over the next 5 in our medium-term financial plan. It is true that there are areas in local government that could be made more efficient. We are discovering these all the time. But to throw around the idea that there are these mass waves of efficiency that will release up £67 million is a little bit far-fetched, and maybe come from national politicians who never actually run anything. Right? They've just got themselves elected. That's a challenge for us, right? And by the way, it costs money to find savings, right? Again, you need people who can comb over an organisation and identify these things. All that takes investment at the front end. It's not free to find savings in your organisation and find these increased efficiencies. I think the second thing, I'd be interested in a bit of a national narrative around the future of growth. And I don't know, I mean, Andy, you'd be better positioned than me to say whether this was possible. The markets want, obviously, you know, sane finances. But actually, one of the things that perhaps we take into account in the future of our economy is the health of our population and the stability of our population. And then maybe you begin to take into account the potential of cuts to cost the future economy, reducing the health resilience of your population, reducing the social bonds and the resilience of your population in a way that actually would be, would undermine the basis for growth. As a businessman in Bristol, John Savage once said, you know, riots are not good for inward investment. If we keep cutting and cutting and marginalising and having more people fighting over fewer resources, we create more unstable conditions that I don't think are necessarily good for an investment. Now, I'm not saying I've got any hard numbers around that, but to me, it seems to be self-evidently true. And one of the narratives I wonder that we could put on the global stage is, we are going to take care of our finances. This is the time frame over which we're going to do it. And in 5 years, we will have the most resilient population and workforce in Europe or the world. The kind of place you're going to want to come and invest, because we've released multiple points of talent. We've got a stable society with sane politics, and this is the place you're going to want to come. And I just, my sense is that could actually be worth money to the UK.
Just on that point, I mean, just, if you don't mind, Charlotte, just picking up the baton from where Marvin put it down, we could do just what Marvin said, right? There's no reason why, as a country, we couldn't take stock of the sorts of stocks that Marvin was just talking about right now, which aren't just the stock of physical capital, or indeed the stock of human capital, but also the stock of social capital in a place, the stock of our health endowment, which is also a capital stock that we don't often think about nurturing.
And we found that out with COVID now, right? Of course, health is an economic issue.
Yeah. Of course we have. So, there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't score societal success in a somewhat different way. In other words, plural rather than singular, and stock rather than flow. And then the allocation decisions, budget decisions, are made through the lens, is this helping us accrete these capitals, plurals? Let me get a case in point. You know, when we're scoring in budgetary terms to pay the wages of nurses and doctors, we score that as current expenditure in the same way as we score teacher salaries or classroom assistant salaries as current expenditure. But actually, to some significant extent, that is an investment in the human capital of children in schools and in the health capital of patients in hospitals. So even the definitions we use for budgetary purposes between current and capital spending are often a bit blurry. And of course, even when we make investment decisions, overt investment decisions, we don't really score them properly. We score the debt we rack up to invest them, but not the assets that accrete as a result of making them. Which is why you asked me before about, you know, autumn statement or fiscal rules generally. I think one cast just in terms of debts misses a trick. And the trick it misses most fundamentally is not recognizing the assets that are generated when you often do spend money as a government.
And I really welcome that change of language from spend to investment. If we put money into children's mental health, that turns up as that looks like a spend, but actually we've probably just reduced the future burden on the National Health Service and reduced the likelihood of that person ending up being arrested by the police and end up in a criminal justice system with all of that. And we don't, there is no coherent narrative around how we account for that. And then that kind of conversation requires us to look beyond the current year to a 10, 15, 20-year life course of investment and benefits, doesn't it? Right?
It does.
Because the benefits will be in the future.
And none of this is beyond the wit of human. There is such a thing as intergenerational accounting. And we ought to have it and we ought to do it for just the reason Marvin mentions, that for many of the most precious spending decisions and investment decisions we make, the payoff only shows up a generation or more hence. And not scoring that in our budgetary arithmetic is to miss a pretty big trick.
So at CPP, we pride ourselves on being or providing intelligent optimism. We don't want to be the doom and gloom naysayers. We want to forge a new economic framework, as you know, that can help us deliver inclusive ground and make that really real. But I'm just going to be a bit pessimistic just on those 2 points that you made. One is that when I worked at your current organisation, Andy, at the RSA, we ran the City Growth and Inclusive Growth Commissions, both of which were very well received by government, and I guess we're enjoying the legacy of that now with devolution and levelling up on the agenda. But in conversations with Treasury and DCLG as then, and to the group of Permasecs, I raised this scoring, capital investment, revenue spend, etc. point. And I was told, first of all, that it was a slippery slope. So as soon as you score one thing, then, we become Greece, don't we? Because suddenly the credibility of our accounting goes down the pan. And credibility was a real theme of this morning's conversation. How do we restore economic credibility, political credibility? And I think, if we're imagining kind of the opposition, how would it potentially make the case for doing just what you described as a core part of its manifesto? How would it do so at a point where economic competence and management and stability are just the kind of core currencies for government? And I just don't understand how we can potentially break through that credibility gap at the moment, as much as I would want to see the kind of thing that you're describing. And then just to be pessimistic once again, you said that it's not beyond the wit of man for us to think about, cracking that resilient population, kind of unlocking huge amount of talent, making our cities investable, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that is a vision that we at CPP have, and I know that Marvin and colleagues at Core Cities and elsewhere are working hard to deliver it. But on skills, we have not cracked it. It is that persistent policy failure that is one of the obvious reasons why we have this so-called productivity puzzle. It ain't so puzzling when we look at how much we just sap out of our further education system and adult skills budgets and all the rest. So how do we overcome that credibility point, and how do we finally crack skills, and then on the health side, the prevention aspect. Because again, to your point, you know, when so much is going through acute, we can't seem to keep resource on the prevention side to realise that resilience vision. So either one of you, come back with some optimism to my pessimism, please.
You go first, Marvin. You don't want me to?
Well, I've got the answer written down here.
There you go. We'll go with that one.
I'm just joking, but I've got no answers.
I'm happy to kick it. Optimism. I've become more optimistic later in life, actually. I'm not entirely sure what it is. On your first, you said, you know, is now a time to try something quite different when it comes to fiscal arithmetic and fiscal rules. Well, I mean, what I was suggesting actually isn't that radical. I was suggesting a way of keeping score that recognised assets that were created as well as liabilities. And that's not radical because it was the same proposal that was made by the current head of the Office of Budget Responsibility just before he took up office. So when Richard Hughes was the Resolution Foundation, he wrote this great paper, great for all sorts of reasons, but particularly for the title, because it was a paper on fiscal rules in the UK, and the title was Britannia Waives the Rules, which is the best title ever for a paper on fiscal policy. It's a fairly low bar, but nonetheless. And it was making a case for keeping score by a fiscal rule that was about net financial assets rather than just recognising the debt. So that isn't radical. It's out there. On skills, you know, Charlotte, I share your prognosis, your diagnosis of this being, you know, long-standing Achilles heel of UK PLC, but actually there is no larger supply-side problem or defect than the skills and staff couplet that we face right now. There are many and various forms of that skills problem. I haven't got time to do justice to them all, but in some ways, some of the kind of killer diagnostics there are that, you know, that so many of the UK workforce leaves education without even the base layer of foundational skills and being able to write and read and add up. You know, you need look no further than that for a diagnostic on failure before you even get to the structural underinvestment in vocational skills for at least 50 years in this country, et cetera, et cetera. We do not lack, by the way, we do not lack for initiatives or papers written on what those many and various defects are. We've got initiatives galore on skills. The problem is, when you add them up, the totality of those initiatives is still, for my money, a decimal point out when it comes to rising to the skills challenge we've been accumulating over 50 plus years. So it's not new stuff, it's existing stuff done at a fundamentally different scale than we've been able to put in place since probably the Second World War, to be honest.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
there's a bunch of stuff here, if I can read my scrappy notes as I was going. First off, on skills, I actually chair the LGA City Regions Board. And we've got 5 core strands of activity, right? One of them is about skills. And what we've been arguing with central government for some years now is that there are 46 different programs of skills run by multiple government departments, none of whom talk to each other and none of them are locally accountable.
Yeah.
How the heck does that work? Right? It's a chaos for being less than the sum of your parts right there. So not only do they not work with local government, they don't work with local economies. And so we've been arguing, devolve it. Let us bring some, by the way, there's no substitute for money. Don't devolve without resource. That's a hospital pass. But devolve it, give it resource, allow us to work. And you made the point earlier on, Andy, when we talk about place leadership, we're not just talking about local government. We've developed something in Bristol called the City Office. And that recognises that cities, places are collective acts. Right? What anyone gets from any place is a result of local government, health service, private sector, unions, and so forth. So we would work with our partners in a place to say, what are we going to look like over the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years? What does that skills pipeline have to be? And if we had the power and the resource, we could begin to do that. And by the way, when I talk about devolution as well, I think there's a subtlety here. Devolving power to the place level does not mean the absence of national government. I think it's about a weighting of leadership and followership at any particular point in time. There are places and there are times when your job is to be a good follower, right? And that empowers leadership. And devolution must not be about, well, it's over to you, I'm withdrawing, I'm just going to watch whether you succeed or not. And I think skills is a place where the weighting of leadership should go to the place, and government should come in as a high-quality follower of that place leadership. I would also say I think there's a twin issue that we just touched on that goes with skills. It's no point having a skilled person who's at home with back pain and depression. Health has to go alongside skills as a partner issue, and good health creates the conditions in which someone's more likely and more able to acquire the skills for a whole bunch of reasons, right? They've had good nutrition, they've got a stable home, they've got a kitchen desk on which they can work, the home is warm, all these things are going on. People have more resilience, they can overcome failures, so they can cope with exams and the learning process and all that. So the two things, have to be, I think, held together. And dare I put a plug in for the piece of work that we're co-chairing here, Andy. So Core Cities and RSA are co-chairing a piece of work on the future of urban Britain. I think there are three simple questions at the heart. What are cities? And we do look at cities, but I think the lesson can expand out. What are cities? Let's properly understand what they are. What do we need them to be? All right? So let's look at the challenges and opportunity in front of us, and how do we get them from what they are to what we need them to be? And I think that is lining up a coherent agenda, investment-based narrative around skills and housing delivery, health, and all the other things that we need for our cities to become everything, not just they need to be, but the country and the world needs UK cities to be.
Brilliant. Well, at this stage, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So we'll start over this side first. So that gentleman there and then behind you.
Hi, Peter Dickinson, Institute for Employment Research. I was interested in what you were saying about treating public expenditure as an investment, and I thought for things like the Big Society and the work programme and Delaney approaches to employment support programmes, I thought that was all on the agenda at the end of the noughties and the start of last decade. Was it tried and failed, or wasn't it tried?
Okay, something on employment support. We'll take a few. Up there, and then we'll go to the next back.
Hello, Mark from the Centre for Inequality and Levelling Up. I had a question on local government funding and allocation. I imagine you must have seen something about the Trailblazer agreement with West Midlands and Greater Manchester. So I had just a question in regards to what you're expecting and what we would like to see in that Trailblazer agreement to simplify funding to local governments.
Okay, so funding simplification, brilliant. Yep, one there and then Jim there.
Next steps in releasing the skills morass that you have identified.
Skills. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very good session, I thought, by the way. What is your position on the so-called 15-minute city and its consequences for retail, employment growth, skills, healthcare? I'm sure you have a view. Would be grateful to know what it is.
Wonderful, thank you. So a range of questions there on employment support, what works, where's it gone? How do we simplify local government finance? And how do we really make another push on skills? Plus 15-minute city, sorry. Any or all of those? Either one.
Shall I have a crack at 15-minute city
Go
just
for
to
it.
start? As with most things, I think there are pluses and minuses to it. And clearly we need to find a way of making more life livable in the smaller space, so that the demands on people to move around and use energy to have to get around. We in Bristol,
We're trying to build lots of homes. We've had some good numbers, but one of the points we make is the kind of homes and where we build them will be one of the biggest determinants the price the client pays for our growth. So we're trying to build on brownfield sites in the middle of the city in active travel zones, and that's all very good. And I think that's what a lot of people talk about with 15-minute cities. My only issue with 15-minute is actually a big one. In growing up in Bristol in the 1980s, I lived in a 15-minute city. Yeah, it was called racism and poverty. And it locked us into our area, right? And we rarely went out of Euston and St. Paul's. And actually, that background of poor quality transport and all the rest of it led to a fragmentation of Bristol that had really negative consequences for those who lived in the city more broadly, but certainly for those who were locked into their community. And I think that some of the conversation around it has been, dare I say, quite privileged, environmental, middle-class led, and not necessarily taking account of some of the downsides. So, yes, we need to have local, supplies on the doorstep and all the rest of it, and strong communities. But I do want people breaking down the barriers that actually fracture the city. On local government financing, and I'll leave the history bit alone, but on local government financing and simplicity, this is what I'd like to do, and I hope it comes out of the work that, or there's a doorway to it that comes out of the work that Andy and I are doing. Let's have a proper evidence-based understanding of how this country works, and then let's co-create a proper strategy that's a 10, 15, 20-year horizon for how we work with the way the country works, to take on the challenges and take the opportunities that we want, and then build a finance machine that will actually support that financial journey we need to go on. And that will, as we've talked about earlier on, involve public money to de-risk, make the market, release the expertise into the places that it's needed, and support us to access private sector finance as well.
Great, thank you.
Maybe picking up one or two of those that Marvin didn't. I mean, on the first, I think your question was the big society not tried or tried and failed? It was never really tried. It was only really kind of employment support dimension.
You treat public expenditure as an investment in the financial markets, and then you treat public expenditure on something like an employment support programme as an investment, to attract investment from the financial market, although it could apply to health or crime prevention or whatever. And then you get a return on that by reductions in crime or increasing skills and health. I thought those were underpinning discussions around the big society and the work programme and those sorts of things, and it just doesn't seem to be around anymore.
No, I mean, you're right. So that social impact investing market, about which there was a lot of optimism and ambition, you're right, around the time of big size. This is the question. And there has been some examples of that. So social impact bonds are out there, but the truth is the market has not taken hold in the way that was hoped. I don't think that's established that the market couldn't be established. It's just that it hasn't been established yet. So I think it's still an area that's definitely worth thinking about and continuing to nurture, which I know is happening. As deep-pocketed investors, patient investors, are starting to, rethink their own responsibilities, including for the environment. We've seen a big green finance movement. There's no reason why we couldn't see an equally large movement around the S as well as the E in ESG. And this be one way of giving that practical effect, I think. So I would say there's still a potential there to do much more than has been done. And in the particular area of employment support, I think the case is even stronger now than it was back in 2010 at the time of big society, with so many younger people in particular actually actively dropping out of the workforce completely, which is a real diagnostic on failure. On trailblazer deals and what might be hoped for, well, I know for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, the two Andys are hoping for skills devo, and from what Marvin said earlier on, that would make perfect sense, actually. If we are to make good on these local skills improvement plans, we'll only make good on those by having local skills powers in place. I hope that's at least one element of it. I hope the question for West Midlands is open on health. Some of the evidence most recently is that devolution of health in Greater Manchester has made quite a difference, actually, to longevity, and I think we can build on the success of that. And on the skills morass and how we navigate a course through that, I say part of that, I think, is just curtailing the proliferation of initiatives and investing in whatever it might be, T-levels or apprenticeships or help to grow at scale on a nationwide basis. I also think, though, we need to look very hard at the manner of delivery of our teaching and learning to those already in the workplace. The truth is, those most in need of having their skills topped up are those least likely to engage in adult learning. And it isn't enough. Recent research from the RSA just last week suggested when it comes to what are the barriers or blockers to people commencing lifelong learning, adult learning, it isn't all just a story about jobs and skills. Often it's about local agency, individual agency. Often it's about what your local community peers are doing. So we need to think much more imaginatively about how we get people to restart their learning journey when in many cases they've been put off that learning journey by school. Nothing would bring them out in a rash more than the thought of going back into the classroom on a mid-career basis. Let's think savvy about how best we reach those that are currently not being reached by formal education, whether young or in adults. And one example of that?
Just a quick one, otherwise Sam gets cross.
Time's up, please shut up, it says. Brackets, Andy. Gaming. Lots of people who are otherwise put off by the notion of being in the classroom and would not think for 1 minute about reading a book, would read cover to cover and memorize every line a gaming manual, and therein might be a way of unlocking doors for those currently which the door is locked.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to both of you. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. Do I feel more optimistic by the end? I do, actually. I feel like with the quality of leadership that I know that there is out there in local government and the continued leadership of people such as you, Andy, and I hope CPP and our friends gathered here, that we, in many ways, we know what we need to do. So it's about beating a path to make it happen. And where we don't know what we need to do, in, say, for example, the work that you're doing through the Commission, we're going to go and find the evidence to figure it out. So with that, we shall leave it here and look forward to the subsequent sessions. Thank you.